Mayberry never existed, yet an entire country still feels homesick for it, a small town built on kindness instead of conflict. Andy Griffith proved a sitcom could stay gentle and still be great. Here is where that cast is now. He made one of the most selfless creative decisions in sitcom history by refusing to be the funny one. As Sheriff Andy Taylor, the calm center of Mayberry for all 249 episodes, Andy Griffith deliberately played the straight man so that Barney and the rest of the town could shine, a choice that shaped the entire tone of the show. He was 34 when it premiered and 41 when it ended. And behind that steady screen presence was a man who had once punched a wall hard enough to break his hand while filming the ferocious drifter in A Face in the Crowd, proof that calm was a performance choice, not his natural temperament. His personal life carried real complications too. He divorced his first wife after 23 years, went through a second marriage that also ended, and found lasting happiness with Cindy Knight in 1983, though longtime crew members always suspected a deeper, unofficial romance with his on-screen love interest, Aneta Corsaut, that never quite became public. In 1983, he was struck by Guillain-Barré syndrome, leaving him temporarily paralyzed before a full recovery. He died in 2012 at 86, and 2026 marks what would have been his 100th birthday, with his hometown of Mount Airy planning a full centennial tribute to the man Mayberry was built around. Long before he became the nervous, self-important deputy Barney Fife, a performance that would eventually earn him 5 Emmy Awards, Don Knotts grew up in a house where his own father held a knife to his throat during episodes of paranoid schizophrenia, a childhood terror that quietly fed the anxious energy he later turned into comedy gold. He was 36 when the show began, and 40 when he left the main cast after 5 seasons, a departure driven by a Universal movie contract he had already signed based on Andy Griffith's original plan for a short run. His personal life moved through 2 earlier marriages before he found lasting stability late in life with actress Frances Yarborough in 2002. Few people know he was also a genuine World War II veteran, having served as a drill instructor in the Pacific, an ironic footnote for a man famous for playing someone who could barely hold a gun steady. In his final years, he grew nearly blind from macular degeneration, but kept working anyway, relying on timing and voice to carry performances his eyes no longer could. He died in 2006 at 81, and 2026 marks 20 years since his passing, with his daughter Karen still touring her one-woman show, sharing stories about the father behind Mayberry's most beloved deputy. The warmest woman in Mayberry could barely stand her own co-star. Frances Bavier played Aunt Bee, the apron-clad heart of the Taylor household for all 8 seasons. Yet on set, she and Andy Griffith rarely spoke outside of scenes, her disciplined stage background clashing hard with his practical jokes, until she finally called him before her death to apologize for being difficult all those years. She was 57 when the show premiered, and 65 when it ended, already a classically trained Broadway actress who had appeared in The Day the Earth Stood Still, and she resented that audiences only ever saw her as a television housekeeper rather than the serious performer she considered herself to be. She never married, and after the show ended, she moved to Siler City, North Carolina, sight unseen, retreating into a solitude that grew more severe with age. In her final years, she became a virtual recluse, living alone in a deteriorating house with roughly 14 cats, a stark contrast to the tidy, nurturing home she had once played on screen. She died in 1989 at 86, and her will still provides an annual Christmas bonus to the entire Siler City police force, a quiet, lasting connection to the fictional sheriff's department that made her famous. For 38 years, Jim Nabors loved a man named Stan Cadwallader in near-total secrecy, terrified that revealing his sexuality would end the career that had made him famous as Gomer Pyle, the sweet, naive gas station attendant whose Shazam and Golly became 2 of the most quoted phrases in sitcom history. He was 32 when he joined the cast in 1962, discovered by Andy Griffith performing a hillbilly comedy act at a small cabaret in Santa Monica, an act built on the same warmth that made Gomer instantly beloved. His career expanded far beyond the show, revealing a rich baritone singing voice nobody expected from that speaking style, and for 42 straight years he sang Back Home Again in Indiana live at the start of the Indianapolis 500, becoming one of the most cherished traditions in American motorsports. A liver transplant in 1994 saved his life after a hepatitis diagnosis, and he lived quietly afterward on a macadamia nut farm in Hawaii, far from the pressures of Hollywood. He died in 2017 at 87, but not before he and Stan finally married in Seattle in January 2013, once the law allowed it, closing out decades of hiding with a wedding that let the real Jim Nabors finally live as openly as Gomer always seemed to. George Lindsey was actually sitting in the waiting room hoping to land the role of Gomer Pyle when Jim Nabors walked out with the part instead, and rather than sending him away empty-handed, Andy Griffith remembered him well enough to create an entirely new character just for him, giving Mayberry its beanie-wearing Cary Grant impersonating cousin Goober. He joined the cast around 1964 at roughly 35, and few viewers would have guessed that the actor playing such a lovable simpleton had actually been a star quarterback on a football scholarship and held a real degree in bioscience before ever considering acting. His marriage to Joanne Herbert lasted 36 years before ending in divorce in 1991, after which he spent the rest of his life with longtime companion Ann Wilson. Career-wise, Goober only grew from there, carrying him into 2 decades on the country variety show Hee Haw and into Disney history as the voice behind characters in the Aristocats and Robin Hood. He also quietly raised more than $1 million for the Alabama Special Olympics, a generosity that rarely made headlines the way his beanie cap did. He died of heart failure in 2012 at 83, and the film festival he founded in Alabama still supports young filmmakers every year in his name. When Don Knotts left the show, the writers had Thelma Lou marry someone else to close out the storyline, and Betty Lynn was reportedly heartbroken by it, convinced that Barney's steady, patient girlfriend belonged with him and nobody else. She appeared in 26 episodes between 1961 and 1966, and as a teenager during World War II, she had actually toured the China-Burma-India Theater with the USO, singing for wounded soldiers while carrying a pistol for protection, a far cry from the gentle Mayberry sweetheart audiences came to know. She never married in real life, joking instead that she was married to the public, and despite her convincing on-screen chemistry with Knotts, the two remained close friends rather than anything more. Decades later, the writers finally gave her the ending she always felt Thelma Lou deserved, marrying her to Barney in the 1986 reunion film Return to Mayberry. In a case of life-following fiction, she eventually moved to Mount Airy, North Carolina, the real town that inspired Mayberry, where she became something like an honorary citizen, regularly greeting fans at the Andy Griffith Museum. She died there in 2021 at 95, and the town still holds tributes to her every year during its Mayberry Days festival. Elvis Presley once called the McNear household personally asking to speak with Howard, and his son Kit hung up on the king of rock and roll twice before realizing the call was real. A strange footnote for a man best known as Floyd Lawson, Mayberry's chatty, absent-minded barber whose halting delivery made him one of the most distinctive characters the show ever produced. He was in his late 50s when the series began, already a respected radio actor who had voiced Doc Adams on the original Gunsmoke, a far more dramatic register than the gentle confusion he brought to Floyd. Around 1963, a massive stroke left the left side of his body paralyzed, and rather than write him off the show, Andy Griffith personally asked him to return, with the crew quietly building him a chair and positioning him to hide his disability while he worked. His halting, spaced-out delivery, often praised as inspired comedic timing, was in part simply the sound of a man struggling to speak clearly after his stroke. He remained married to his wife Helen from 1935 until his death, and he finally had to leave the show in 1967 when the physical demands became too much. He died in 1969 at 63, still remembered by fellow character actors as a masterclass in turning almost nothing into something unforgettable. Fans who only know Jack Dodson as Howard Sprague, Mayberry's fussy, mother-dominated county clerk always trying and failing to seem cool, are often stunned to see him turn up as a truly menacing figure in Sam Peckinpah's violent crime thriller The Getaway, a role that revealed range almost nobody expected from the actor. He joined the cast in 1966, around 35 or 36, discovered by Andy Griffith after a Broadway production of Eugene O'Neill's Huey left a strong impression, and he brought that same theatrical discipline to a role built specifically as a cultured counterpoint to the more rustic Goober. He married Mary Weaver in 1959, a pioneering television art director in her own right who worked on shows like Battlestar Galactica, and the two stayed together until his death. Cast members remembered him as the actor's actor of the group, serious about his craft in exactly the way Howard was serious about his clerk duties, a quiet parallel between performer and character that rarely gets mentioned. He died of heart failure in 1994 at 63, and Howard Sprague has since become something of a cult favorite among longtime Mayberry fans, remembered fondly for his awkward, earnest attempts to be modern in a town that never quite wanted him to change. Long before she became the steady, sharp-minded schoolteacher Helen Crump, the woman who finally gave Andy Taylor a marriage worth watching, Aneta Corsaut had already spent a film fleeing a giant gelatinous alien opposite Steve McQueen in the cult classic The Blob, a fact that still surprises fans who only picture her in Mayberry's classroom. She joined the cast in 1963 around 29 and appeared in 66 episodes, standing her ground against both Andy and Barney in a way none of Andy's earlier girlfriends had managed. She never married, though castmates and later biographies of Griffith described a long, off-and-on affair between the two that ran throughout much of the show's production, an open secret that never became anything more permanent despite reported proposals. Away from acting, she was an avid reader who co-authored a mystery quiz book, and she eventually reunited with Griffith professionally, playing a judge on his later series Matlock. She struggled after Mayberry to escape being typecast as the sweet schoolteacher archetype, a frustration common among performers who found unexpected fame in a small-town setting. She died of cancer in 1995, just days after her 62nd birthday, closing out a life that had once seen her scream from a monster and later marry the most beloved sheriff on television. Fans loved Otis Campbell so much that they used to mail Hal Smith bottles of liquor, mistaking his convincing stagger and slurred speech for lived experience, when in truth the man playing Mayberry's town drunk for 32 episodes was a lifelong teetotaler who rarely touched a drop. He built the character's wobble purely through observation, a detail that made his eventual exit from the show almost inevitable, since temperance groups and sponsors grew uncomfortable with a jailhouse regular treating incarceration like a hotel stay. Away from Mayberry, he quietly became one of the most prolific voice actors in animation history, giving life to Owl in Winnie the Pooh, and later stepping into the role of Goofy after the original voice actor passed away. He married Louise Smith in 1936, and the two stayed together for 56 years, a devotion that outlasted nearly everything else in his long career. When Louise died in 1992, friends said something in him quietly went out, the performer's spark he had carried through decades of work simply gone. He died 2 years later, in 1994 at 77, reportedly of a broken heart layered over a heart attack. A quiet ending for a man who had spent his career pretending to be someone he never actually was. Nobody watching Emmett Clark shuffle around his fix-it shop would have guessed the actor playing him could still throw a flawless silent film pratfall between takes, since Paul Hartman spent decades before Mayberry as one of the most celebrated comedic dancers in American entertainment. He joined the show in its 8th season, around 63, brought in specifically to fill the grumpier, more cynical space Howard McNear's Floyd had left behind after his health declined. Long before Mayberry, Hartman and his wife Dorothy had been the Hartmans, a headlining vaudeville and Broadway dance duo, and he won a Tony Award in 1948 for his performance in Angel in the Wings, a level of theatrical pedigree rarely seen in a small-town sitcom. Dorothy died in 1957, and he later remarried, to Abbott Reeve in 1962, carrying the discipline of his dancing years into a much quieter final chapter of his career. Colleagues often said his stillness as Emmett was its own kind of performance, a controlled economy of movement from a man who had spent most of his life doing the exact opposite on stage. He died in 1973 at 69, grateful, by all accounts, simply for the steady work Mayberry gave him after a lifetime spent chasing the spotlight. On screen, Clara Edwards and Aunt Bee traded pickle recipes and gentle rivalries as Mayberry's closest friends, but behind the scenes it was Hope Summers who often had to smooth things over, acting as a quiet buffer between the notoriously prickly Frances Bavier and the rest of the cast. She played Clara across 32 episodes, a woman defined by her pickle ribbon ambitions and her devotion to the church organ, and Summers herself didn't find national fame until she was already in her 60s, a late arrival after decades spent founding her own regional theater troupe back in Evanston, Illinois. She had been widowed after her marriage to Claude Whiffen ended, and she poured much of that later independence into her career instead, becoming a familiar face on Bewitched and The Rifleman before landing her most recognizable post-Mayberry role as Mrs. Hasty in a long-running series of cleaning product commercials. Unlike her on-screen counterpart, she had real musical training from her time at Northwestern's School of Speech, giving her organ scenes an authenticity that audiences never realized was real musical skill rather than performance. She died in 1979 at 81, a career built almost entirely on patience, arriving late to fame and still managing to leave behind a face people recognized everywhere. A classically trained Jewish actor from the Bronx seems like an unlikely candidate to create one of television's most iconic Appalachian hillbillies. Yet Howard Morris turned Ernest T. Bass, the rock-throwing, rhyme-spouting mountain man obsessed with finding a sweetheart, into an unforgettable character across just 5 episodes. He was around 44 to 47 when he filmed those appearances, having built his early reputation on Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows before quietly becoming one of Mayberry's most trusted directors, occasionally guiding entire episodes from behind the camera. His personal life moved through 5 marriages, a restlessness that friends attributed to an intense, almost manic perfectionism carried over from a childhood shaped by his father's death during the Great Depression. That same drive fueled a directing career far beyond Mayberry, including Doris Day's final film and pilot episodes for shows like Get Smart, alongside decades of voice work as Jughead Jones and the jet-puffed Marshmallow Man. He developed Ernest T. His hyena laugh and step and slide walk entirely on his own, a piece of physical comedy so precise it outlived nearly everything else on the show's run. He died in 2005 at 85, having spent barely half an hour of screen time across 8 years but leaving behind one of the most quoted characters Mayberry ever produced. Most actors spend their 60s winding a career down, but Burt Mustin didn't even begin his professional acting career until he turned 67. And by the time he was playing Judd Fletcher, the harmonica-playing town elder who spent his days bickering good-naturedly on a bench outside the courthouse, he had already lived several entire lifetimes as a car salesman and an engineer. He was somewhere between 77 and 82 during his 14 episodes, discovered almost by accident when director William Wyler happened to catch him performing in a local play and cast him in Detective Story. His marriage to Frances Robina Hogue lasted 54 years until her death in 1969, and he never remarried, choosing instead to pour his remaining energy entirely into work that most people his age would have long since abandoned. Crew members remembered him as having more stamina than actors decades younger, often playing harmonica between takes just to keep the set entertained, a habit that eventually turned his usual spot into what everyone unofficially called Burt's Bench. He went on to become Hollywood's go-to elderly character actor, appearing in All in the Family and Sanford and Son well into his final years. He died in 1977 at 92, proof that a career can begin exactly when everyone else assumes it should end. Walking away from a steady, high-paying role was almost unheard of in early 1960s television. Yet Elinor Donahue asked to be released from her contract as Ellie Walker, Mayberry's progressive lady druggist and Andy's first real love interest, after just 1 season, choosing her own well-being over continued fame. She was only 23 at the time, though she had already spent nearly 2 decades working non-stop since childhood, having become the primary breadwinner for her family as a young performer alongside stars like Elizabeth Taylor, before finding household fame as Betty Anderson on Father Knows Best. That exhaustion, paired with what she has described as a lack of chemistry with Andy Griffith, pushed her to prioritize her own health over the security of a 3-year deal, a remarkably self-aware choice for someone still in her early 20s. Her personal life later found firmer footing through 3 marriages, including a long and happy one to television producer Harry Ackerman that lasted until his death in 1991 and gave her 4 sons. She continued working steadily for decades afterward, from The Odd Couple to Days of Our Lives to a memorable turn on Star Trek. Now 89, she remains one of the last surviving members of the show's very first season, still appearing occasionally at nostalgia conventions to share what Mayberry looked like before it became legend. In the show's famous opening credits, 6-year-old Ron Howard couldn't throw his fishing rock far enough to make a proper splash, so a prop man hid behind a bush and threw a larger rock at the same moment, creating the image millions would come to associate with Opie Taylor and Mayberry itself. He appeared in the role for all 8 seasons, and the show quietly became a family affair, since his real parents, Rance and Jean Spiegel Howard, both acted on the series, alongside his younger brother Clint, who played a boy with a memorable sandwich in one episode. Andy Griffith treated him like a second father on set, encouraging him to contribute ideas to scripts, a mentorship that planted the earliest seeds of his eventual pivot into directing. That transition wasn't instant or easy, since escaping the clean-cut Opie image meant deliberately chasing gritty, complicated projects once he moved behind the camera, eventually earning him an Academy Award for A Beautiful Mind. He married his high school sweetheart Cheryl Alley in 1975, and more than 50 years later they remained together, raising 4 children, including Bryce Dallas Howard. Now 72, he continues directing major projects through Imagine Entertainment, frequently appearing at industry events alongside the daughter who grew up watching Mayberry's most famous child star become one of Hollywood's most respected filmmakers. The Darling Boys never spoke a single word across their entire run on the show, communicating only through nods and music, and Rodney Dillard has said the real challenge was staying stone-faced, while his fellow actors tried every trick they could think of to make the silent brothers crack up mid-take. He was in his early 20s when he and his real-life band, the Dillards, brought authentic bluegrass to national television for the first time, insisting on playing every instrument live rather than lip-syncing, a choice almost unheard of on 1960s television. That commitment to the real thing helped the Dillards go on to influence the entire country rock movement, shaping bands like the Byrds and the Eagles in ways still cited by music historians today. His brother and longtime bandmate Doug died in 2012, leaving Rodney as the primary keeper of a musical legacy the two had built together since childhood in Salem, Missouri. He married Beverly Cotton, herself a skilled banjo player and clawhammer dancer, and the two still perform together as a duo. Now 84, he continues touring the Bluegrass Festival circuit, often blending music with stories from the Mayberry set in shows fans have come to call Mayberry Memories, keeping the Darlings' quiet, musical spirit alive more than half a century later. Andy Griffith reportedly got teary-eyed every time Maggie Peterson sang one of the show's slower mountain ballads, since her rendition of It Ain't No Use as Charlene Darling remains one of the most requested clips from the entire series, a haunting voice wrapped around a character famous for her innocent crush on Pa's friend. She was in her early 20s during her 5 episodes, having grown up performing with her family's singing group before Capitol Records discovered them, and her chemistry with the Dillards on those recordings was so natural that fans still assume she was actually part of their family rather than a hired actress. She later married jazz bassist Gus Mancuso in 1968, and the two built a life together that lasted 53 years, eventually settling into a quieter second career when she became a respected Nevada film location scout, helping bring major Hollywood productions to the state for decades. When Gus died in 2021, those close to her said she seemed to lose her fight along with him, her health declining rapidly in the months that followed. She died just 6 months later, in 2022 at 81, closing out a life where the mountain girl who once sang for Sheriff Taylor and the jazz musician she loved for over half a century turned out to be inseparable even at the very end. Mayberry never had a crime worth locking anyone up for. Which resident would you most want as a neighbor? Subscribe for more from Classic Hollywood.